As I understand it, I've been asked to talk a little bit this evening. Nathan very kindly invited me to come along and to talk a little bit about some work that I was doing several years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago, for a thesis at King's in London. And I'd have to say that a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. And that's a polite way of saying I've forgotten most of what was happening at that time. Theses, as I'm sure some of you will be very well aware, have this wonderful habit of completely dominating your life for a period of time. And then when they're submitted, they sort of sink into this black hole, this abyss, never to be seen again. And I suspect that's what's happened with my work. This is the first time I've been asked about this particular project since the Viva, which was just a few days before Christmas, which was a wonderful Christmas present at that time. So, without more ado, I am going to talk a little bit about some of the findings of that project, and I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along. But in order to set the scene for that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to talk a little bit about some theory. Now, before you completely switch off, I hope that I'll try and make this as interesting as possible. But I do need to talk a little bit about a bit of theory so that you can understand what it was that I was trying to get out of the actual project that I was doing. So the overall thesis was actually called Shaped by God's Story, ? And the particular research question that I was trying to look at was to get a sense of how much people are changed, if at all, by reading the Bible. So in order to get that going, I needed to spend a little bit of time thinking about some reading theory, how people might start to make sense of what they're reading when you pick up a Bible and read it. And the story for this story really needs to go all the way back to Friedrich Schleiermacher, who is remembered as one of the leading theologians of the early modern period, about 200 years ago. And Schleiermacher established what you might call the groundwork for this wonderful thing called hermeneutics, which is just simply a posh way of talking about how people make sense of a text, any text. So if you get a letter from the bank manager, you will be applying certain expectations and certain rules to the way in which you read it, which will be different if you picked up another piece of literature that started off something like Once Upon a Time. That would have different reading rules and different expectations and so on associated with it. But that general hermeneutical theory also applies quite specifically to a text like the Bible. But it's just that people have different expectations of what they're likely to get when you pick up a Bible and start reading it. Now, for Schleiermacher, any act of reading requires what he called a science and an art. Reading for Schleiermacher is both science and art. It's a science in the sense that you need to know something about the grammar of the language that you're using, you need to know something about vocabulary, you need to know something about the language rules that apply when you're actually reading that text. But more than that, Schleiermacher reckoned that that wouldn't get you very far, simply knowing the mechanics of how to read a text. In order to actually understand that text, you also had to work with it. You had to engage your imagination. So for Schleiermacher, feeling and imagination were actually key words. He's actually operating in the Romantic era, and so he's reacting against some of the rationalism of his time. Now, as a technical skill in terms of your grammar, for Schleiermacher, you need to be able to go through that process of reasoning about the text, analysing it, taking it apart, and so on. But as an art, he used, rather unfortunately actually, the word psychological intuition. He used the word psychological in a sense that we wouldn't these days. It's kind of shifted its meaning, it's changed a little bit. But for him, the psychological bit was that you were attempting, when you read a text, to enter into the mind of the author, he claims. Hang on to that because we'll come back to that a little bit later. But for Schleiermacher, you've got to try and get into the mind of the author. And he thought that actually a good interpreter, somebody who's reading a text competently, would be able to understand the author's mind better than they understood it themselves. Now, that was a very carefully qualified statement that Schleiermacher made, but that's kind of basically what he's getting at. So he thinks that you've got to really, if you're going to understand the Bible, you have to have these two tools. You need the technical competence, and in his day, that meant moving in the direction of biblical criticism. It was a fledgling academic discipline in those days, but it had already started towards the end of the 18th century, and people were learning to analyze the Bible with some basic critical tools. And Schleiermacher thought you had to use those. That was one of the technical competencies that you needed to understand a biblical passage. But then after you had done your research on the passage, you then had to try and enter into this imaginative engagement. And in fact, more than that, he thought that this was not something you could do one-off and just do it and settle for that. He thought that understanding is a process, an ongoing process, which is almost a little bit like a cycle, or perhaps a spiral would be a better way of talking about it. For Schleiermacher, everybody approaches a text with certain presuppositions and assumptions. You already have a working understanding of what you think those words on the page might mean from your general life experience and your general understanding of language and so on. But that pre-understanding that you bring to your reading of the text is going to be changed in some way. It's going to be modified as you engage with the text and it captures your imagination. So you're now involved in what's become known as the hermeneutical circle, which will go something like this. Understanding a text, any text, but we're talking mostly about the Bible this evening, understanding is that gradual process of engagement in which you start off with your initial reading and your initial presuppositions about what it might mean, and you start off trying to get a sense of the whole book or the whole text, and not just all the individual sentences or the individual words. But as you try to understand that text a little more fully, then you are necessarily going to have to focus from time to time on individual components. That's the analysis, where you start taking it apart. And so now you're looking at individual words, individual sentences and sections and so on. And that detailed analysis for Schleiermacher is going to be both of the text and the author, which you're then going to feed back into your greater understanding of the text as a whole. So now you've got that kind of hermeneutical circle, where you're starting off with your initial presuppositions from the text as a whole, and you're coming back through your detailed study to that whole text. But in the process, you're kind of hoping that you might have picked up something interesting en route that will change your perspective and begin to make better sense of the whole thing. So now you've got a revised reading which will help you to move on around that. Now, unfortunately, Schleiermacher's emphasis on reading the Bible as both a technical skill and as an imaginative art really got eclipsed by the growth of biblical criticism, which took off in a big way in the first half of the 19th century, particularly in Germany. Didn't arrive on this side of the channel until the 1850s, that kind of period around then. In the excitement of the rise of modern biblical criticism, a lot of that more crafting stuff, that more artistic approach to a text, got lost in the kind of noise that was around there. It is important to stress that although biblical criticism got going in that first half of the 19th century in a big way, it was not something which had just come out of the blue. It had much deeper roots than that and had deeper history. In fact, actually, you could argue that some of the very earliest theologians, I've mentioned in this slide, Origen, in the 2nd century, is already doing some of this biblical criticism as he's reacting to some of the bits in the Bible that he's not quite comfortable with, and he's trying to make sense of it. Jerome, the translator of the Greek Septuagint into Latin, the Vulgate, also is engaging in a form of biblical criticism. A Jewish scholar, Ibn Ezra, in the 12th century, again, is doing something very similar. But it's really about the time of the Renaissance that you start to get the questions coming to the surface that will lead to the development of 19th century biblical criticism around that. By the end of the 18th century, by the time Schleiermacher is writing, you've already got some of the big names. You've got, in the Old Testament, you've got a guy called David, and Astruc, a French guy, who are preparing the way for another guy called Wellhausen, middle of the 19th century. Very, very important in Old Testament scholarship. New Testament, there was a major storm of controversy around a couple of people called Lessing and Reimarus. Reimarus was quite a radical German scholar, end of the 18th century, who died without having published very much, but one of his great fans, a guy called Lessing, arranged for the Reimarus's writings to be published posthumously. And when they were published, it was a storm of protest to how radical this guy was in terms of his understanding of the New Testament. Now, one of the net results of that is that by the second half of the 19th century, there were many people right across Europe who were beginning to think that the Bible was on its way out. Some people would say that's probably still true, but that's perhaps another issue that you might want to pick up on later in the conversation. This particular verse from Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, is often cited as that kind of one of those watershed moments, if you can have that for the Sea of Faith, a watershed moment where you can almost feel the wistfulness of Christianity beginning to lose its hold on the public imagination. And one of the reasons that's often said for that starting to happen at this period was the impact of biblical criticism in this country. By that stage, it had just crossed the channel and was beginning to have a huge impact. This is also, of course, the time of Darwin and the rise of evolutionary theory and so on. So there's a lot happening at the same time. Now, whilst that's going on, in the field of language studies generally, a couple of big names just to drop into the pot here. An American philosopher whose name I always wanted to pronounce as Pierce. It's actually pronounced, I'm assured, Peirce. Now, how you get Peirce from that, I really don't know, but apparently that's what you do. He was one of the first philosophers to do some serious work on analysing the way language works as an art of communication. And he invented something which some students have come to know and dread, known as semiotics, a rather obscure kind of science of studying the way that language works. There was a Swiss philosopher, de Saussure, who a little bit later than Peirce starts to do much the same sort of thing. And de Saussure has had a huge impact on biblical studies. Some of his thought has been foundational in the development of some particular approaches to language. Roughly speaking, this is taking gross liberties with the complex thought of both philosophers. But in very broad terms, you could argue that Peirce and Saussure are arguing that language really only makes sense in a series of relationships. If you try to study individual words, you will be led up the garden path. You will think that you've got hold of some kind of understanding or concept, but it's only when you put that word or words back into a complete sentence, or better, into a complete text, that you can begin to understand something of what the author wants to say. That will lead eventually, any of you who are into philosophy will know the work of the great Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1951, posthumously again, his book that's published, which has a whole range of wonderful sort of aphorisms about language. And for Wittgenstein, the kind of the cliche that captures, I think, this sense that Peirce and de Saussure are already pointing towards. For Wittgenstein, he has this line, doesn't he, that the meaning of a word is its use. You can't tell the meaning of the word until you can see how it's actually used in a sentence, and you get that sense of meaning from looking at the overall context. Now, cut a long story short, these two influential thinkers are responsible for starting a trend in biblical studies which becomes known as structuralism, which is looking at a guy called Levi Strauss, did a lot of work here. He's interested in trying to understand what's going on beneath the surface of language. You know, you can pay attention to the words that are used at the top, but what's going on underneath in terms of the meanings, the deeper meanings, and some of the feelings associated with that. Now, one of the things about structuralism is that after the historical analysis that was all the rage through most of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, but was preoccupied, fixated on trying to understand the history of the development of the biblical texts. Now, with the influence of structuralism and language studies beginning to take effect, you get a shift back to the text. So from about the middle of the 20th century onwards, you're starting to get people paying more and more attention again to the way that the text works in itself. So people are starting to say, it's all very interesting, all this stuff about the author and all about the background, the history of the text and so on. But what's more interesting is the way the story works, how this narrative works. And John Barton, who's recently retired as Professor of Old Testament, Oxford, Barton, I think quite helpfully, suggests that there were 3 bits that came out of this kind of return to this drift back to the text. It is, first of all, an understanding that a text, any text, including anything in your Bible, is basically an artifact, a thing in its own right that has a life of its own, an integrity of its own, and it is abused if you start to use it as a window, trying to understand the mind of the author. Do you remember all that stuff from Schleiermacher about trying to understand the mind of the author? Well, Barton and the structuralists that he's speaking about are really saying that that is a false move. You can't know the mind of the author. Second point, therefore, the author's intention in writing the text, a biblical text, is essentially unknowable. You can never know what Paul actually thought he was doing when he was writing to the Corinthians. You can get a good idea from the letter itself, but you can never enter into his mind and work out exactly what was going on in there. In fact, actually, psychological studies of contemporary modern authors would suggest that 9 times out of 10, the author themselves doesn't know what they're doing when they're writing. They're just writing a text. So all this kind of wild speculation about what might or might not have been going on in Paul's mind or in the author of the book of Deuteronomy or whatever it might happen to be, it's essentially unknowable. You can't know that. So instead, you should focus, you should pay attention to actually what you can know, which is the text itself. In our case, our interest is in the Bible. But going on from that, you need to remember that as you try to wrestle with that text and make sense of it, you are already located in a tradition. You do not have a completely free hand. You are located in a tradition which is putting some constraints on what you think might be possible to understand that text. Actually, I think there's a helpful distinction that comes out of some of this preliminary work here between what is sometimes called a competent reading and an incompetent reading. Now, a lot of students struggle with this one. A lot of students want to know the right answer. And when you tell them that there is no such thing as a right answer, but there are plenty of wrong answers, they kind of look at you as if you're stupid. But it's making the same kind of distinction. There's an important distinction between a competent reading and an incompetent reading. If I just to give you a silly example, if I was to write a wonderfully flowing and deeply moving sentence such as "the cat sat on the mat," you could say that there are many different things that sentence could mean. You could ask questions about what kind of mat, what kind of cat, what does sitting imply, and all those kind of questions, and you would very quickly find there are a whole range of different possible answers, even to a silly little example like that. But all of those possible answers would be competent readings. They would be plausible interpretations of that data. But if I was to tell you, if I was to insist to you that if you read something like "the cat sat on the mat," what it basically means is that Elvis is alive and living on the far side of the moon, you would know that I'd finally flipped. That would fall into the category of an incompetent reading, because whatever else those words mean, and they can mean many, many different things, they cannot mean that Elvis is alive and living on the far side of the moon. Unless, of course, that cat sitting on the mat is actually a secret code for Elvis living on the far side of the moon, in which case you're then into a different set of questions around that. What we're beginning to do now is we're beginning to discover that meaning is a very slippery thing. And every time you think you're trying to get hold of it, you're probably likely to find that it's going to slip away before your very eyes. Now, this led into the development of something which is, I think, really quite intriguing. It's become known as narrative criticism. So there were explosions, particularly we're up to about the 1970s-ish now. And at this stage, all the rage in biblical studies is to focus specifically on the text and to try and understand how this works. So you get development of a whole range of critical skills. I've just made a list here of some of the things that, believe it or not, PhD theses by the ton have been written on every one of these things. But you can analyze a text. It could be Deuteronomy, it could be 1 Samuel, it could be the Gospel of Mark, was one of the earliest texts actually to be analyzed in this way. But you'd start to try and understand a little better how Mark, if you stick with that example, has constructed his story of Jesus. The plot line that he wants to deliver, the structure, the way in which he's telling the story, beginning, middle, and end, the style, closure, timelines, and so on. So just to give a couple of very quick examples on that, the plot from Mark, to sum up, and Mark is a fascinating text, so this is a gross oversimplification, but the plot line in Mark would go something like, Jesus has been sent by God in order to die. And the good news in Mark is that if you want to follow Jesus, you better get yourself crucified as well. Now that is apparently good news for Mark. And the subplot in Mark, unsurprisingly, is the disciples constantly fail to get it. They're constantly making a mess of it and misunderstanding what's going on. And speaking from my own perspective, I'm not entirely surprised that they weren't all that euphoric about the good news that Mark is offering them. But that struggle, that tension is being worked out in Mark's particular plot there. The structure is, it has an interesting structure. It's generally a linear movement forward, except in Mark you get a whole load of what are known, if I can remember, prolapses and analapses, I think that's the correct term, where you get leaping forward and leaping back in the text. So flashbacks and things like that happen. John the Baptist, for example, appears in a couple of flashbacks in Mark's stories. And you can then start to say, well, why has Mark chosen to tell the story in this particular order? What's that telling me about the way he understands it? So closure. In Mark's gospel, classically, of course, he doesn't close it. It's one of the things that drove Matthew completely mad when Matthew rewrote Mark's gospel. One of the first things he does, it seems to me, is make sure that it ends properly, because Mark doesn't. Mark will leave you there hanging. His last line, almost certainly, was 3 words in Greek, ephebuntoga. 2 words in Greek, ephebuntoga. Yeah, for they were afraid. What a way to finish a gospel. For they were afraid. Yeah. So what's he doing? Why has he chosen to finish his gospel in that particular way? And so on and so on. Timelines. Interestingly, as you go through Mark's gospel, the pace accelerates. So the first few chapters, the first 12 chapters, 11 chapters, probably take 2 to 3 years of Jesus' ministry, cover that period. But then as you get towards the climax of the story, the pace quickens. Or does it slow down? It slows down, doesn't it? Because you then get 3 or 4 chapters given over to the last week of Jesus' life. And then as you get to the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, you're down to 2 chapters. So that's telling me something about Mark's perception of the importance of the story. He wants us to really pay attention, and so on and so forth around that. So, as we move into this era of narrative criticism, a number of theologians outside the field of biblical studies were beginning to ask, again, some interesting questions. And I haven't got time to run through a whole list of stuff. You'll be pleased to know I haven't got time to run through a whole list of the different projects that approached from this kind of angle. But I just wanted to mention one of the superstars, I think, in this league, a guy called Hans Ur von Balthasar, wonderful aristocratic name, Austrian Catholic theologian, died at the ripe old age of 84, 3 days before the Pope, John Paul II, was about to make him a cardinal. So he just missed out by 3 days. But brilliant thinker, was a Jesuit at one point, but dropped out of the Jesuits and founded his own order. And he saw himself actually not as a theologian, but as a spiritual director, and spent a great deal of his time involved in spiritual direction. But he wrote a number of books. Like a lot of German theologians or German-speaking theologians, the books come out by the ton. You don't count the pages. You feel that you weigh the books. And his great masterpiece is called The Glory of the Lord. It's a wonderful collection of 3 books. And in one of them, he comes up with this idea that, well, okay, if the Bible is more like a story, if we start to understand that the power of the Bible is to capture the imagination, Perhaps we need to just think about that a little bit more. And as he walked through his own understanding of what it means to approach the Bible as a story, he came to the conclusion that actually it wasn't quite a story. He thought it was more like the script of a drama. As a script, he said one of the extraordinary things about this is that the way in which God is involved at every level of this script. So God is the star performer, the star character in the story. But God is also the producer and the director and everything else, almost even the stage on which the performance happens. But this ever-present, all-consuming God who runs throughout the biblical story, and in fact actually for Christians, well, not just the biblical story, life full stop. This God graciously expects us to participate. So we are recruited as actors. And by the very virtue of being born, we are engaged in that story, whether we want to be or not. But you can choose which character you're going to play. So you can choose whether you're going to be for or against, whether you're going to go with the flow or against the flow, and so on. But you are invited to join into this drama. Now, that idea of what Balthasar called theodrama has been substantially developed by, again, a whole range of theologians. The Reformed theologian, Calvinist theologian, Kevin Van Hooser has done a lot of work in that area of developing many of these ideas. Our own Anglican, Sam Wells, now vicar of St Martin's in the Field, has also done a lot of work there. And many of you, I suspect, will be familiar with Tom Wright's work, who's also picked up on some of this stuff as well. But this idea of participating in a drama, I think, is really important. It's worth just kind of spelling it out a little bit. And this little snapshot here is trying to give you one version. This is Sam Wells' take on this idea. For Sam Wells, you have to imagine that the biblical drama is set out in 5 acts. Now, 3 of the acts are already in the bag. That's the story of Israel and the story of the early church. That's all done and dusted. That's done. That's given. And you also need to know that the final act is already fully scripted. That's already worked out. So we know the beginning of the story, the first 3 acts of the story, and we know the end of the story. And the whole notion of theodrama is that there are you and I in the middle. And we are called to join the dots, to make the connections between those 2 parts of the drama, so that actually disciples in the Gospels, disciples in the contemporary church, are inserting themselves, placing themselves in this flow of story. But notice the blank there. The script for this part of the story has yet to be written, because you're doing it, and you're doing it right now, one way or another around that. For Wells and for Tom Wright and, as I say, a number of these other thinkers, that is the vocation of everyone who has been baptized, to actually live out God's story, to perform. Van Hooser is very strong on this idea that every time, every day, is a part of a Christian performance, or not, of the Bible, a script to be performed in our own ordinary lives. Now, just park that for a second. The last little bit of theory before we come on to my empirical study. Just want to say a very quick word about some reader response criticism. This, again, is another one of those isms that's actually fascinating, but comes in different forms. So I'm going to skate over a whole load of complexities that really we don't need to worry about this evening. But please do be aware that I'm going to give you an overly simplistic take on this. 2 scholars, Wolfgang Isser and Stanley Fish, particularly closely associated with some of these basic ideas here, in which they are building on some of this thing about openness of language, the way language works at a deep structure, the way in which it invites us to participate and to perform that script and so on. But Isser and Fish are arguing that because any text, not just the Bible, but any text, is necessarily ambiguous and open, and meaning is always elusive, that means that now one of the key roles of the reader when you read a text is to fill in the gaps. And most of us will do that most of the time without even thinking about it. We will assume that what we think those words mean must mean. Sometimes do a little experiment with students where kind of invite them to close their eyes and then just listen to this one-line story. You might want to try it now. It can be done quite quickly. If I tell you a one-line story that goes something like so, just close your eyes and let your imagination take you where it will. Okay? The story goes like this. The ship blew its horn as it sailed past the house on the beach. The ship blew its horn as it sailed past the house on the beach. Okay, so just very quickly then, just to illustrate the point, can I just ask for one or two volunteers to tell me, first of all, what kind of ship it was? Anybody, any volunteer? What kind of ship was it? Steamship, yeah? Anybody else have anything different? Yeah? Sailing ship, yeah? Anything else? Liner, yeah? Anything else? Tug, yeah? Anybody have anything different? Keep coming. Passenger ferry, yeah? Okay. What about the horn? What kind of horn was it? Foghorn, yeah? Anything else? Anybody have anything different? Yeah, okay. Sorry? Hooter, okay. What about the house that you saw on the beach? Lighthouse? Beach house. What kind of beach house? Wooden, yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
Big enormous luxury house.
Big enormous, yeah, you dream on, yeah. Yeah. What kind of beach was it? Sandy beach, yeah. So we're in the Caribbean, are we? Or was in the, no, where are we? English Channel. Oh, a bit more down market, isn't it, really? But, yeah. Anything? If I was to tell you the authorial intent, as the author of this text, I can tell you with some authority that actually what I had in mind was Jason and the Argonauts. Yeah? Now, what does that mean? Does that matter that none of you were within 1 million miles of it? Does it matter? Or is it actually the fact that the story has a life of its own? Even a trivial little story like that has a life of its own. But notice, please, that there was no fixed meaning, and we could argue forever about the significance of the shape and size and type of ship, for example, that was going past, because we could never agree. We would be bringing different assumptions, different values. Now that happens every time you read a passage, however short, however long, from the Bible. You're doing that all the time. You're supplying your own meaning to what you think those words must mean. And we're back now to Schleiermacher and the hermeneutical circle, where you're going to bring those assumptions, whether you're aware of it or not, to your understanding of the text. These words must mean, it's obvious, isn't it? It's what it means, yeah? Until you start to engage with the text, and then you might start to be challenged and to change your view as you go along. Stanley Fish was a little bit more radical. He argued at one point, he changed his mind a little bit, but he argued at one point that there is no meaning at all in a text until somebody constructs it. A reader will always bring their own meaning to a text. He then made an important qualification. He said the reader is not operating in a complete vacuum, but they have already been taught from the moment they're knee-high to a grasshopper, they're already beginning to build up an understanding of what these words might mean. They've got associations and feelings and understandings of those kind of words, which they will automatically bring with them to the text. I've just come this afternoon from another little meeting with our young grandson, who's now 9 months old, but is already learning the meaning of life. He has blissfully no awareness of this whatsoever, but he's already having his life constructed for him by the significant others around him. And the same it was for us. From the moment we started being in contact with other people, we had our expectations and understandings about language shaped as it's going on. Right, I'm going to rattle on very quickly. Just one last thing. The final mix. Some of you will know about Jacques Derrida, a somewhat mischievous French philosopher. French philosophers, I think, almost by definition, delight in being totally obscure and using fancy language to try and wrap up some really quite basic ideas. But Derrida made a career out of pointing out just how elusive language is and how difficult it is to pin it down. And every time you think you've got hold of a text or an understanding, it will, as soon as you start to think about it, it will disappear before your very eyes. He talks about meaning being erased, and if you're into anything, if you get anywhere near Derrida or any of his followers, you'll find that lovely little symbol, that cross there, where that very word meaning has been crossed out. That's this symbolic way of saying that every time you think you understand, you don't. Because that meaning will slip away from you as soon as you got it. He had a lovely play on the French word différence, which can mean both difference, our English word difference, but also to defer. And he thinks that those two words together are absolutely characteristic of language, any language, that meaning is always constantly deferred. It's always slipping away from you all the time that you're going on, and so on. I've given you another silly little example here. If you take another sentence like, the car ran down the road, turned on the sixpence as the driver hit the brake, in order to make sense of something like that, you would need to have an understanding of some of the words, or a pre-understanding of what I meant by car, a sixpence, a brake, and so on. You'd have to have a basic understanding of what you thought running meant in this context. But if I asked you what you meant by running, well, I've already told you that I'm hoping to sort of run the London Marathon next year. Is the car running in that sense? Has it got 2 legs, or is it 4 legs? This is being used in a metaphorical sense, obviously, so I don't mean it in that sense at all. When I say hit the brake, what am I going to do? Use a stick? Am I going to use a hammer? What am I going to do to hit the brake? As soon as I start to ask questions of even a silly little text like that, I'm going to be taken away from my certainties very quickly into a world of ambiguity and elusiveness. And for Derrida, that is the characteristic of any text. It's always elusive. So, when we hear, as we often do in church, very well-intentioned and well-meaning people talking to us about the plain meaning of Scripture, what on earth does that mean? Well, for me, actually, what I hear when someone starts talking about the plain meaning of Scripture, plain meaning of the Bible, I hear a bid for power. This is a way of trying to persuade me that this particular person's way of filling in all those gaps and elusiveness in the text, this particular person wants me to be persuaded by their point of view. Again, this is another little wind-up, but I think it works, actually. If you try and just remind ourselves, actually, from time to time, that there is no such thing as a fact, there's only ever spin, what somebody wants you to understand as a fact. And that's what's going on, I think, most of the time when we hear these wonderful statements at endless church meetings about the plain meaning of Scripture. There is nothing that's very plain about Scripture, as anybody who's ever tried to study it, I think, very quickly discovers. It's probably true, though, I think, that most people, most of the time, because we don't stop and think about it a great deal, tend to assume that, the text means what it says, which being interpreted means the text means what I say it means. And even more precisely, the text means what I say it means at this particular time when I'm reading it, because next week when I read it, I might see something different in it. And I guess most of us have had that experience of reading a text many, many times and then reading it one more time and seeing, oh, I've never seen that before in there, I suspect that for many people, most of the time, we have this kind of slightly simplistic, perhaps even naive view that what's happened with the Bible that we've got in front of us is we've got an author. We might have a certain amount of discussion about who that author might be, depending on our churchmanship and so on. We might say it's Paul, we might say it's God, we might say it's Holy Spirit, or we might say all of the above in some way. But we're going to say, well, the author wants to tell me something, and they're telling me something quite clearly by means of a text, and all I've got to do is have a competent reading. If I can just read properly, I can grasp what they're saying. And I suspect that's probably true for most people most of the time. And I think the biblical version of that would look perhaps something like this: God, Bible, believer. Simples, as they say, around there. Or is it? In the 1920s, a group of engineers actually working on early radio communications and trying, particularly with the military, but for broadcasting as well, to improve the standard of broadcasting, developed what's become known as the Shannon-Weaver theory, which I think applies to most people's understanding of the Bible. It looks a little bit like this. The Shannon-Weaver theory is you've got a sender, somebody who wants to tell you something, communicate a message, and they're going to use some kind of medium to get their message across. In this case, it's a radio medium, so they've encoded their language as clearly as possible in the various electronic signals that they need, and they will transmit it via the transmitter to a receiver. And the receiver all the receiver has to do is competently decode the message that they've received, and hey presto, sender and receiver understand each other beautifully. And the idea, that the reason they were developing this theory was because in the early days of radio, of course, there were lots of static, lots of problems with getting a clear signal. So they wanted to make the encoding and decoding bits, the two sides of the sender and receiver bit, as clear as possible. Now, when I hear people talking about the plain meaning of Scripture, I think they're operating with a model fairly similar to that. They think that a simple message, that Americanism actually, I hear people more and more these days talking about messages from the Bible. But I think this is Shannon Weaver. You want to have a message from the Bible that is transmitted as clearly as possible. But the problem is that as soon as you start to look at even just the logistics, if you accept a simple model like this, there are a whole range of problems that very quickly kick in. For example, it assumes that the sender has a clear message to communicate. Now, I don't know about you, but I often don't know what I'm talking about, even when I'm talking about it. Yeah? It assumes that the reader is entirely passive. All they got to do is simply let this stuff wash over them and it will sink in, and hey presto, it's all there. And it ignores the interference, the stuff that fiddles about and mucks up the system in between. Now, what I've very inadequately been talking about at great length for far too long is, in a nutshell, I think, put together by another French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who's been hugely important in studies around the way people find meaning in texts like the Bible. Ricoeur himself was very sympathetic to the Bible and did some important work. He wasn't a biblical scholar, but he did some important work in this area. And amongst some of the many different things that he talked about, one of the points I want to pick up on, with apologies to Bethany, because she's seen a version of this before, Paul Ricoeur talks about the world behind the text, the world in the text, and the world in front of the text. And believe it or not, that's what we've been talking about for the last half an hour or so. The world behind the text is the world that has captivated and fascinated historical critics. They want to know all about the world which produced these particular kind of texts, and what kind of world was Paul living in, what kind of world were the authors of 1 and 2 Kings living in, and so on. The world in the text is the world which is constructed by that text. What kind of world does the author want to invite me to join in and participate in? And the world in front of the text is this last little stuff, really, about the way we as readers engage with the text and supply at least a part of that meaning. We fill in the gaps as we're reading the text. And what that means is that, I'm just using an example here of a picture which tries to make the point. If I was going to try and decode that picture, I'd need to know something about the background, what's going on behind the text, and what some of you may or may not know is that this figure here hasn't come out very clearly. That's my wife, Linda. And I don't know whether anybody actually knows where this is set, apart from our summer holidays this year, so that's another bit of information. It's where? It's Venice, St. Mark's Square, yes, that's right. Very hot day in July. We're there on holiday, and so we've got a whole load of history here about Venice, and there's St. Mark's Basilica there, and the tower that you can go up and so on. The world within the text, you can see a whole load of other tourists wandering around. You can see a lot of building work going on. And there's a story, I can tell you, I won't go on now, but a story about why I took this particular photograph. That would be background, but I've tried to tell a story, a family story, by taking that particular picture. And the world in front of the text is me. I'm taking the photograph. But I'm also framing it. I'm choosing what you can now see. I've selected the story that I want to tell you around that. So for Ricoeur, those 3 levels are going on, whether you're aware of it or not, every time you start to read a text. Now, Gadamer, Ricoeur and Gadamer had quite an interesting partnership. They agreed about a lot of their understanding of the way that texts operate, but they also profoundly disagreed, and they had some very famous heated debates with each other. But Gadamer is a bit more conservative than Ricoeur, but he's also, I think, very important just to finally, it's a bit about this theoretical background to the study. For Gadamer, going back to Schleiermacher, interpretation is always a process, and it involves an art. Unfortunately, he wrote in German, but his translators chose to translate one of his key words using the English word prejudice, which is kind of has all sorts of interesting connotations for a lot of English speakers. But it doesn't mean prejudice in the sense that probably most of us would understand it. By prejudice, what Gadamer means is the same sort of stuff that Schleiermacher 200 years ago has already said, that none of us come to a text in a vacuum. We come with presuppositions, we come with biases, we come with assumptions, we come with a pre-knowledge of what we think these words might mean. But there is a problem, says Gadamer, of temporal distance. What he means is if you're reading an ancient text, or actually not even one that's that far away, but particularly acute with a texts that are 2,000 years or more old, they're coming from a different cultural background, and now there's a cultural gap between what I think is normal, natural, and obvious, and the world in which those texts were created in the first place. So for Gadamer, the task of reading competently, making sense of a text, involves what he called the fusing of horizons. And he thinks that you've got two worlds. You've got to take account of the world of the reader and the world of the author. Let's stay with Paul and assume that this is his first century Greco-Roman Eastern Mediterranean world. And then there's you and I in early 21st century Western Europe, specifically the UK. We are worlds apart, quite literally worlds apart. But for Gadamer, intelligent reading, sensible reading, involves something rather like this. I hope you were impressed with the animation. Yeah? We're now moving towards the ideal for Gadamer, where our two worlds have started to overlap, and we're learning from each other. So I'm questioning the text, and the text is questioning me. Now that, for Gadamer, is the process which brings about an intelligent and intelligible reading of the text. Okay, enough of the background. You'll be pleased to know, just rattling on very quickly, this won't take so long, I think, because it's not so interesting, but 8 years ago now, I suppose more than that, 8 or 9 years ago, I started this project, which took 2 or 3 years to complete, which involved a little bit of empirical research. By empirical research, what I mean is I went out and asked some people some questions. I wanted to know how people actually made sense of biblical passages. So I was looking for some volunteers, and I was very pleased to have the cooperation of 22 people in the end. I started out actually just looking at 20, and deliberately tried to get a sample of different kind of approaches to their understanding of Scripture. So approached 5 Catholics, 5 Anglicans, 5 Pentecostals, actually from a black-led Pentecostal church. And I also tried to identify 5 people who were either happy calling themselves atheists or at least non-churchgoers. And it actually became quite difficult to identify the people who would take part in this study because I didn't want to influence, I didn't want to self-select myself the kind of people who were going to give me the answers. I wanted as much diversity and range as possible. So I had to do a little bit of fancy footwork in asking other people to ask the volunteers for me to get as wide a diversity as possible. As we were going through the exercise, my supervisor, Dr. Deborah Rook, suggested, she said, "There's some interesting results starting to come out here, Alan. I think you need to go and ask some Jews." Because we were getting some particularly interesting stuff coming out of the Hebrew Bible, out of the Old Testament stuff. So I then followed her advice and started to contact some members of the Jewish community. But as you will probably be aware, the Jewish community outside certain pockets in London is a little sparse. and I found it difficult. I aimed to get another 5 to balance the groups and failed, could only get 2. But the 2 Jewish participants who volunteered for this came up with some excellent results and so included it in the study, even though they were underrepresented in the sampling that was going on there. For those of you who are into such things, the approach was a semi-structured open interview. That is to say, I went along with a script of provisional questions, but quite deliberately they were leading questions, open-ended questions, which were designed to get them to answer in any way that they wanted to. And if they went off in a different direction, we'd just follow that through and see what happened. But I wanted to try and control the conversations a little bit so that we could compare, or I could compare, the different answers that I got to those questions, the different responses. Each interview lasted about an hour, and the interviews were transcribed. I spent God knows how long, typing up the interviews and listening very carefully, and discovered that a great deal of the important material actually came out of things like the ers and ums and the repetitions that people were doing, as they're going on, because that told me a great deal about their thinking processes that were going on around as they were doing these things, And I've just made a list here of some of the areas that we had those conversations. It was a dialogue, and they had a life. Each interview had a life of its own. Well, I wanted to know a bit about their background, a bit about their current understanding of life, which I left deliberately very open, but I was fishing for hints and clues to their basic values, beliefs, and assumptions in life. Their current understanding of the Bible, what they thought the Bible was, how aware of the Bible they were, and really some quite interesting responses there. Their feelings toward it. Do they find it boring? Do they find it interesting? Do they find it energizing? Do they find it disturbing? What sort of responses when you just talk about the Bible? What did they choose to talk about, and so on? And I was interested in their ability to give me an account of what they thought that the Bible was about, in very broad terms, those kind of things, And then towards the end of each interview, I asked them to participate in a little experiment, and I gave them the text of 2 Psalms from the NRSV, Psalm 23 and Psalm 36. And I deliberately, cunningly chose those Psalms quite carefully. Psalm 23 on the grounds that it is so stunningly well known that it was most likely that most people would already have some kind of opinions about what it might mean. And Psalm 36, because most people have never read it, and therefore it came as a complete surprise. And they would have to do their interpretation on the hoof. And actually both those assumptions turned out to be true. And we were then able to kind of compare their prepackaged views on Psalm 23 with their thinking out loud on Psalm 36 as we went along. Here are just some of the key findings, just rattle through them very quickly. Obviously, wide range, 22 different people, long conversations, so as you'd expect, a range of different things. Here are just some of the common themes, though, that emerged from those conversations. All but the 2 Jewish participants focused almost exclusively on the New Testament. Unprompted, they would talk about the New Testament. Most of the people, apart again from the Jews, were very uneasy about the Old Testament, didn't know what to make of it, and preferred not to talk about it most of the time. Most of these people really struggled to come up with any stories. I asked them to talk about, what's your favourite story from the Old Testament? Really problem. We got a little bit Genesis, got Jonah at one point, which is quite interesting, but it's really struggling. If people thought about the Old Testament at all, occasionally got the odd snippet from 1 or 2 of the Psalms, including Psalm 23, of course. And yet, interestingly, almost all the Christians, Catholics, Anglicans, and Pentecostals have very strong views on the Bible being foundational. So they were very clear that the Bible was one of the most important texts for Christians. And yet the interesting thing was that most of them didn't read it, but it was still very obviously absolutely crucial there. Range of different attitudes. One of my Pentecostal participants used that lovely phrase that she was hungry for the word. But to be honest, most of the others, Catholics and Anglicans, and 1 or 2 of the Pentecostals, and certainly the non-churchgoers, regarded any task which involved Bible reading as a bit of a duty, and actually, if you're really honest and not listening too carefully, boring. So on the whole, not much energy around it, and so on. Only the Pentecostals talked about reading the Bible regularly, by which most of them meant daily, on a daily basis. For the others, it was much more of a rare occurrence. Most of the participants, including the Jews and the Pentecostals, found reading the Bible difficult, was the most common word that was used around that. And there's strong evidence of a canon within the canon. What I mean by that is very obvious signs of careful selection of the passages that they chose to engage with. So they would talk about the Bible, they'd make all sorts of wonderful, wild, extravagant claims about the importance of the Bible, but actually their Bible would only have a handful of passages in it. And those would be the passages that they'd come back to time and time again around that. And this was, for me, one of the most important findings. When you ask people what they thought the Bible was there for, what was the purpose that it served, very, very clear, overwhelmingly in your face, it's there first and foremost for moral guidance, and secondarily, if you push people, a little bit of doctrine. But it was in that order. Ethics first, doctrine second on that. And very clear impression that most people, and this was borne out by the non-churchgoers, which I found quite interesting. The non-churchgoers agreed with the churchgoers that the Bible was there to tell you how to do it. The only difference between the two groups was that the churchgoers thought they ought to approve of what they're being told to do, what they thought they were being told to do by the Bible, as opposed to the non-churchgoers who cited it fairly regularly as one of the reasons they don't engage with the Bible, because they disagreed with what's. But they agreed that it was there to tell you how to do it. So it's a do-it-yourself manual on how to be a Christian, one way or another. Yep. Other common themes, the Bible believers, which came from different churches, but the Bible believers would give direct instructions. They thought the Bible would tell you directly. Back to Shannon Weaver, clear sort of understanding. Message received, Lord, now I'll go and do it, kind of thing. They had very little expectation, as far as I could tell, had very little expectation that they would change their mind when they read the Bible. This was very important. People already, on the whole, they already knew what that text must mean. So they were bringing their existing values and assumptions to the task of interpretation. So if you take a controversial example like teaching on homosexuality, those people who were already on other grounds anti-homosexual would find, like a guided missile, straight into Leviticus for those passages, which they would then use as a hook for to express their views. But on the other hand, if you were pro-gay, then you would start to look at other passages, particularly in the New Testament, that would challenge that point of view, and the language would immediately start talking about the need to understand Jesus' inclusive love. So they'd shift, they'd be moving to a different set of words. But what they would have in common is that they already had preformed views which they would bring to their reading of the text, that presupposition about what it means. I couldn't find very much difference. I couldn't identify much difference between age and gender. The only variable that I concluded had any significance was place of birth. Those people who were born outside the UK were more likely to have a different view of the Bible from those who had been born and brought up in the UK. But otherwise, I don't think age or gender seemed to have much effect on that kind of stuff. Very quickly then, just to finish off, some key points. When I asked them to read Psalm 23, very interesting, asked people's reactions. This is all about comfort. And one person I thought very helpfully summed it up with Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Waters, around that. God, when you ask people what kind of God do they imagine is behind Psalm 23, here are some of the words: protector, guide, provider. Somebody told me the footprint story, all that one about being carried through the desert, that kind of stuff here. And they thought the psalm was about God's gracious provision and that. The only variation which came out even more strongly in Psalm 36, the reading of Psalm 36, the only variation was the Pentecostals who had, on the whole, had a much rougher journey through life than many of the sort of Anglicans and Catholics and non-churchgoers. But the Pentecostals had a much stronger sense of the need to be protected by God. Whereas for most of the others, it was all about what I'm going to call cuddly teddy bear God, a comforting God who is there to reassure people and so on. Most memorable phrase was, though I walk through the valley of shadow of death. And of course, I'd given them the NRSV, which had a slightly different version from the one that everybody says at funerals. And that really threw them. I actually asked them to read the psalm out loud before I got them to tell me what they thought it meant. And without exception, everybody, including the Jews actually, stumbled over that phrase from the end, because it was ingrained on automatic pilot. They were just reciting it as it went through. Strongly associated with funerals. One of the passing points there is that thing about the rhythm of the language and the familiarity of a well-loved text being picked up by one New Testament scholar guy called Shiloh Brown, American scholar, who talks about the importance of listening to the sound of words and the psychological impact that has on people. And I think in terms of our contemporary liturgies, that's something that we need to ponder a little more around that. But when, after I'd asked people to explain what they thought the text was about, I would then quite deliberately, provocatively and mischievously draw their attention to the switch that happens 2/3 of the way through that psalm. It's a short psalm, only 6 verses, and the first 4 bits are all about the Lord my shepherd, taking me to nice pastures and looking after me and caring for me and all the rest of it. But suddenly, verses 5 and 6, you'll remember, switches to feast imagery. So we're no longer sheep. I don't think we're sheep in verse 5, but we're now at a party. Thou hast set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Yeah? And I drew attention, said, okay, who do you think those enemies are? And that really threw people. Because most people, I think, with one possible exception, most people had not noticed the enemies before. And they then said, oh, I'm not quite sure about that, and we then started to have some questioning and some dialogue about where those enemies have suddenly come from. And I asked them, the next question was, what do you think the enemies are doing there? And then we had quite some lively discussion in some of those interviews. There was a kind of mixed feeling. Some people thought that they were there to get their comeuppance. Hey, look at me, I'm having a party and you're not, whereas other people saw this as a reconciliation scene, that this is us actually making up at the party, But what was really interesting was actually watching people wrestling with trying to make sense of the presence of the enemies there. Just moving on very quickly. Finally, Psalm 36. This was the unknown psalm. Everybody, all 22 participants, including somebody who was a former nun, and therefore used to reciting the psalms on a daily basis, none of them could remember saying this psalm ever before. None of them. Yeah? And I should have put the text up, but I haven't. But you may, if you've got the text in front of you, you might want to quickly take a look at it. The first couple of verses, and the first 4 or 5 verses actually, and the last 2 verses are back in quite a nasty, distasteful mode. It starts off with people with sin whispering in your ear and all the stuff about people gossiping about you and being nasty to you. And so the last couple of verses about calling on God for vengeance, really, to sort out this mess. But in between, there's some nice reassuring language. In your light we see light, and we're kept under the shadow of your wings. Was the only phrase that people recognized, which is quite interesting, because that phrase is used quite a few times in the prophets and elsewhere in the Psalms. So that was a familiar phrase, but it was the only familiar phrase in that Psalm 36 there. What was really interesting in these conversations was the dissonance, the shock that people got when they were being asked to make sense of it, because it did not fit in with their model of God. It didn't fit in with what they thought God ought to be like. And so one comment there, which I think captured the flavour of that, was, this is not a comforting picture. It's not calming, was another phrase that was used there. For one non-churchgoer, actually sat up and said, this is quite interesting. He said, this is a reality check, isn't it? So actually he started to take an interest in the Bible, which I thought was at least some kind of positive gain there. Yeah. But there was generally concern, even amongst the Jewish participants, about trying to make sense. They were struggling to do this. So just to finish then, some general observations. Clear evidence that different readers bring in different assumptions. In the light of the theory I was trying to outline, you might say, well, nothing new there. That's what you would expect. And I think my study demonstrated the ambiguity of a biblical text and the myriad ways in which people will struggle to try and make sense, to interpret a text when it's given to them. They all brought their life experiences. There are a couple of examples I've quoted here. One of my participants worked as a hospice nurse, and so she was making connections as she was reading the Psalms with her work in the hospice. Another person, Jewish participant, is a lecturer, higher education lecturer, but also a background PhD in literature, and he was making connections with his understanding as he was going along around that as well. All of the participants, I think, I've said most here, but I think all of the participants showed themselves willing to enter into a conversation and a dialogue. And in the course of that conversation, they found that they were beginning to change their mind. The one possible exception to that was one Catholic woman, mother, who I interviewed, got terribly anxious, really, really worked up about a passage. And she one of the Psalms, I think it was Psalm 36, she kept saying to me, she said, you're a priest, which was interesting for an Anglican priest talking to a Catholic. Anyway, she said, you're a priest, tell me, what does this mean? And she would not let it go. And in the end, after a few minutes of trying to be polite, because I was deliberately resisting giving her an answer, I wanted to hear what she thought of it. She really got quite exasperated and was getting quite upset that she wanted to know what the answer was. She wanted to have a clear understanding of what the text might mean, and really struggled with this idea that it could mean whatever you want it to mean. Well, not quite whatever you want it to mean, but it could mean a whole range of different things that's going on there. What was also very clear was there was very little awareness and probably even less interest of all the tons of literature that's around on all the Psalms and all the biblical material that's around there. Okay, I've gone on at great length, longer than I should have done. I'm really sorry about that. Some of you will know me of old. Once I get started, you can't stop me, so I apologise on that grounds. But there are some other things. I did some other smaller studies around this, which tended to confirm some of my findings, but I think that's more than enough for now. So let's stop there. Yeah?